Welcome to the Fast Track Cities podcast. In this episode, we're exploring why sexual health isn't often treated with the same importance as general health. Stigma, cultural expectations, and social norms all play a role. The impact is real. Fewer people test regularly, seek support, or feel able to talk openly about their sexual health. Did you know that almost half of STIs in the UK are diagnosed in people under 25? Meanwhile, the number of STI cases has been rising in older age groups, particularly those aged 45 and above. Or that people living with HIV can now live long, healthy lives with treatments, but still face discrimination when accessing care. We'll be speaking with Alan, Louise, and Jose to hear their perspective on why sexual health is often pushed aside and why it deserves the same attention as every other aspect of our well-being. First off, we speak to Alan, who reflects on how society views of sexual health have shifted over time.
I was lucky, I got diagnosed early. I went for a random STI check when I got with a new girlfriend after my marriage broke down. I'd had a few one-night stands in between, so decided to do a sensible thing, which isn't a very common occurrence for me. And I went and got an STI check, and that's how I got my diagnosis, and I was diagnosed early, which meant it didn't have much of a chance to really attack my body. The problem with a lot of heterosexual people is, because they are not seen as high risk for HIV, an HIV test is one of the last things they have. And I've got friends who've only managed to get their diagnosis when they are critically ill in hospital and their immune system has completely collapsed. But because they were heterosexual couples or heterosexual men or women, they weren't tested as part of a routine thing. Unfortunately, a couple of people I know that I've met through a support group that I helped to run, they got the diagnosis too late and didn't survive. But the reason they weren't tested is because they were heterosexual. In the heterosexual world, it's not discussed at all. You know, since the 80s, there has been a really good education and advertising within the LGBT communities. But in the heterosexual world, there has been very, very little. We also need to reduce the stigma of sexual health in total. I've recently been away with the niece and nephew. We took them on holiday. And I mentioned that I was doing this podcast today about sexual health. And the nephew is just started high school. I think he's in the second year or something like that. And his face was shocked that someone was actually talking about sexual health in a public setting. And I went, well, no, it needs to be normalised. You know, it should be the same as going to the GP. Because sexual health isn't just about the birds and the bees and the actual having the intercourse side of it. It's about how to protect yourself in a relationship. It's about consent. It's okay to be who you are, who you want to love. All of that comes into sexual health. And if you can't talk about it, then you don't go and get tested. England is, you know, a Christian society as such. I know we have multiculturals and everything else, but as a general main thing for the country, we are a Christian country. And the morals that are put in place in schools, the morals that the government uses when making laws, are all based around this Christian faith. Part of that is you don't talk about sex. So sexual health in school is, we'll just do this little bit of it in one section and then we won't talk about it again. Whereas it should be more part of an everyday conversation, and, you know, there should be more discussion about relationships and, you know, how to make healthy decisions when it comes around relationships. And that then brings in using protection to protect yourself. And, you know, if you are active sexually, you know, going to the sexual health clinic should be the same as going to the dentist. You know, it should all just flow normally, which is again where the opt-out testing in A&Es is such an important thing, because it's bringing HIV and sexual health testing normalised within an A&E system. So you would then, you know, it's not, oh, I've got to go to a special clinic. You know, when I was young and even when I got my diagnosis, you had to go to a special clinic that was a separate building from the hospital, and everyone knew what that clinic was. And it was a lot of the issue was the stigma of walking through that door. And what are people going to think about me if I go in there because they know what I'm doing? Whereas opt-out testing with an A&E, everyone's on the same page. Everyone's getting the same tests. You know, I'm of an age that I'm just about touching 50. Our sexual health education was very, very minimal outside of what the church would prescribe as normal. You know, it was one male, one female, they do this reproductive thing, and that was all sex was for. Was you have sex to have a baby, that is it. Whereas we know that sex is far more than that. It's connection, it's, you know, the sense of touch, the sense of compassion between two people, you know, and it doesn't have to just be about reproduction. But when we were growing up in the, you know, late 70s and 80s, we were just taught that sex was purely for reproduction, that was it. Only immoral people went and did these things and, you know, had to go for sexual health testing, that's just wrong. And this was what was drummed into us as kids from teachers that you then respect. Anybody who deviated from that was just incorrect. They shouldn't be doing it. If you look at the age range of the people having new diagnoses, the age range is creeping up to 50s, 60s, 70s and 80s. There's a lot of people within that demographic, and we're now at the point where I think on the last set of figures that came out, it was the first time where heterosexual diagnoses outstripped people from the LGBT community. And a lot of it is people who are getting divorced of my sort of age and now going back into the dating world. And because we didn't have the knowledge from growing up that, you know, these things were a risk and HIV's a risk, and a lot of women are going, well, I've gone past that point and I now can't have children anyway, so we don't need protection because we're not going to make a child. And, you know, men have gone through vasectomies because they didn't want to have any more kids, and, you know, I can't give anyone a baby, so we don't need to use anything, because that was how we were taught growing up. And it's now showing as our age group and older are now more at risk of sexually transmitted infections than the kids are, because the kids at least are getting a bit of the new knowledge that you have to protect yourself, whereas our generation didn't. My generation and Gen X that is going to be the hardest generation to change attitudes, because we've had the attitude of you don't talk about sex drilled into us for the last 40 years, 50 years, that trying to change that attitude is going to be very, very difficult. Again, because I, you know, help out in an HIV support group, I help to run one, you know, although we are in a Christian society, we are also in a multicultural society where we have a lot of people coming in from other backgrounds, other faiths. And one thing that we have that is raised as a concern regularly is around people coming in from especially Muslim countries, from around Africa, where having the likes of HIV can get them ostracised completely from their communities. We need to add that into the equation that, you know, there are some societies and cultures where if somebody is diagnosed with a sexually transmitted illness, they can lose their entire families. You know, if it gets out that even if it's found that they're just tested for it, some families will completely, you know, ostracise them just for getting a test. So we need to work out a way of supporting these people who, you know, as a cultural thing are really struggling around sexual health testing. We need to work out a way of supporting them to be able to get the testing they need and the treatment they need, but also keeping the confidentiality, because it's a big thing, confidentiality. There were a lot of people, even in the heterosexual community living with HIV, that are so scared of their HIV status coming out due to the stigmas that they will face from family and community, some of which will actually stop taking medications just to make sure that, this hidden secret doesn't get out. So we need to be working on ways of keeping the confidentiality, but this all comes back to reducing stigma, the education. It's all a big circle that we need to work on as a community and a society as a whole.
Next, Louise discusses the different challenges women and men face when it comes to stigma towards sex and sexual health.
I'd like to believe that things are going to start changing. Yeah, but I think that it's a taboo subject because many people have been raised to understand that sex is something that you should do when you are married. I say that I'm hoping things are changing, but that's the generation that I came from. If you're going to have sex, you get married, and, it's something that you keep very private. And actually, I do believe that sex is as a very spiritual, beautiful practice, But there are other sides that gets a bad rap. So I think that in some parts of society, there is a discussion about how sex is sinful. It's something bad. It's a bad thing to do. It's not a pleasurable thing to do. And if you have sex, particularly if you're a woman, there are different labels that can be attached, that if you have sex out of wedlock, or if you, God forbid, enjoy sex, or you talk about sex openly, it can be, it could be something seen as, why are you doing that? You're meant to keep that private. So I think sex and culture and the way that we are as a society is kind of combined in some ways, and we've got lost in some way, So there's the religious aspect to it, and there's the misogynistic, the patriarchal aspect to it. I think that sex is the most, I keep saying, magical, special, unique, pleasurable thing that human beings can do. But over the years, it's been taken for different political agendas. And those political agendas are still in play. So therefore, people don't often talk about sex, and they don't. And it's a taboo subject. And as the years gone on, it's now sinful. Why would the creator, God, the universe, whoever you believe in, create something or create humans that can do this beautiful act? But it's sinful. You're going to get punished if you do it. You're a charlatan, especially if you're a woman, because don't forget it's different. If you're a man and a woman, it's a little bit different. You're not wifey material. If you enjoy sex, talk about sex, have sex, so all those things are quite complex. So, when I was talking, I was actually thinking of female genital mutilation. Why is it the woman that's had to be mutilated in that way and not the man, So there's some stuff there. Look, it's important that we start talking about it. Look at how far we've come. Let's just talk about, just for a second, periods. Women have monthly periods. There are adverts on television over the years, and they're advertising sanitary products. But they'll use bluing because, God forbid, you realise that a period is blood that comes from a woman on a monthly basis. God forbid you use the colour red. People feel that it's something that I don't quite understand it. I can't always find the words for it when I think about it. I think, to be honest, it's indoctrination. I think as a society, we have been indoctrinated from young children as we grow older. What sex is, how we do it, how we look at our bodies, why, when we talk about it, when we don't talk about it. I think we're literally brainwashed, and I can give you an example. I've got 3 kids, and when they were really young, I said to them, it was the boys because they were older than my daughter, and I said to them, when you get older, you must go to the dentist every 6 months to get your teeth checked. Like you have to. I took them as children. They get older and they leave home. I want to make sure they get their teeth checked. And I said, make sure that you get your eyes checked because it's prevention. You never know. And with my daughter, it was make sure you get your regular smear test. And I said, all of you, regardless if you have partners or not, get down the CLAP clinic, and get yourself regular tests. Even if you're with someone or not, say we've been doing this from the age of 19, 18, and it's something that we do on a regular basis. We go for a sexual health check. So they'd say to their partner, look, don't take it personal. It's just something that I do when I get my teeth checked and I get everything else checked. I have a sexual health checkup as well, so that it's normalised. And I told them, look, this is where I say CLAP clinic because it just gives it a little bit of a jovial edge to it, because that's what it was called in the olden days. But you can go to the sexual health clinic. I told them where it was, and I said you can go there and go on a regular basis and get yourself checked. I didn't think about doing it for myself. I didn't. So why is it I'm saying it to my children, but I didn't go for regular STI tests? You know why I think that is? I think because it's indoctrination. I think I still had this mindset that, I'm okay because I'm a good girl. I don't sleep around and, I'll be okay. Yeah, I think it's just the way that we see the world. And I think when one starts to wake up, you will see that, sex doesn't have to be. Sex can be what you want it to be. It can be what you want it to be. And sometimes sex is abused in all different sorts of ways, and it can be quite traumatic. And sometimes sex is just wonderful and you can actually orgasm. Some people can, some people can't. But sex is not just it's not just one thing. I'm an optimist, and I'd like to believe that things will start to change. And I often talk about different generations. So you've got the baby boomers who are in their 80s. Then you've got the Gen X's, I think, are in their 60s, 70s. The millennials, you have the Gen Zers, now you've got the alphas. I think that with the Gen Zers, from what I can see, they are more kind of open about who they want to be, their sexuality, different genders. LGBTQ is more kind of, I think that Gen Zers are more comfortable about their sexuality, about sex, about who they are, about what they want to do with their bodies, I think, from what I can see. And then I'd like to believe the Gen Alphas would learn from the Gen Zers about sex and their bodies. And so maybe, just maybe, little by little, the taboo about the way we talk and look at sex might change. And then people might be getting tests more. They might talk more openly about sex. They might, there needs to be a cultural shift. But the thing that I don't think will shift, because it's been like this for many, many years, is the religion and sex. Because unless it's changed, I think there are some religions where you're not supposed to use a condom. I think that, I don't follow it to see if it's still the same, but for as long as I've known, there are certain religions where you're not supposed to have sex before marriage and you're not meant to use a condom. So that, I'm not sure if that will change, but I think societal changes are going to happen because generations change. And I'm quite an optimist about that. Is there a responsibility from the church to adapt to the way in which we are now as a society? I'm not a religious scholar, but what I do understand is religions are these structures that are put in place, these policies and these procedures that are put in place, and they're not there to be shifted. From what I understand, I think if they change, I think that the congregation and people who follow particular religions will say, actually, no, I didn't sign up to this. What do you mean it's okay to have sex before marriage? Me, my children, my grandchildren, my dad, my stepdad, we all followed this no sex before marriage. So why all of a sudden you change it? You're changing fundamentally what I signed up for. So to answer that question about is there a responsibility, I don't know, to be honest, because I think that so many people are attached to particular religions. I can't see that happening. I can't see certain religious groups, faith groups, changing their messages to fit in with modern day. But this is what I would say. I would say it's down to people who go to those organizations to say, how can I still go to these religious gatherings, but make it work for me? How can I not feel ashamed and guilty if I have sex with the next door neighbor because I feel like it? How can I still love myself, be okay, be comfortable? I am a human being and not feel shameful and guilty like I'm the worst thing ever because I've stepped outside of the message. So I think the responsibility isn't necessarily with the faith group leaders, not necessarily, because I understand why those policies, procedures, structures, religious groups are in place. It needs to remain like that. That's what it is, you know? But I think it's down to people who go there, maybe to feel safe enough to say, actually, I can still go, but maybe I need to have my relationship with the universe in a way that works for me. I think there's something about if you're married or you're in a relationship, going to get a sexual health check can be quite a statement, can't it? It can be quite a statement. But I think without going into too much detail, I would say that even though you are married or you're in a relationship, you're also an individual, my love. And you need to take care of yourself. And in taking care of yourself, you are taking care of your partner. So if you decide to go for a sexual health check and you're in a committed relationship, married or otherwise, I think it's okay for you to go and get a health check because you're taking responsibility for yourself as an individual. You're not completely joined at the hip. You're not. And I think it's quite healthy to say, actually, I'm also a person. There's part of me that is just me. With certain sexually transmitted infections, they don't show themselves until many, many years later. So that is why I say it's okay to do that. What I understand is 90% of the world population have had sex. So if 90% of the world's population have had sex, this is something that's so very important, your sexual health. But we have allowed systems, culture, indoctrinations, and other systems to stop us from taking, real ownership about our sexual health. And it's not our fault as human beings. It's what we've been taught, and it's what they've been taught, and it's what they've been taught. And this is all learned behaviour. But this is what HIV has done to me. It's empowered me to be absolutely free and to love myself and to think about myself and to get myself checked and to make sure that I'm having my breast examination and my smear test, all these things, I thought, this is my body, and I want to be healthy for me and my husband and my children, and I can't keep allowing these systems to shame me into either not talking or not acting.
And finally, Jose shares his thoughts on the broader social attitudes towards sex and sexual health.
I'm Jose Mejia. I'm a 39-year-old Colombian-born Londoner, I will say. Yeah, I've been living with HIV since 2008. Yeah, I was around I think 21 at the time or something along those lines. And I'm part of the London HIV Ambassadors program, so I sort of do a lot of advocacy and work around HIV and HIV stigma around London with healthcare professionals and sort of other professionals in statutory services. I'm a single and sexually active gay man, which is why I kind of like and enjoy talking about sexual health, I guess.
Why is sexual health still seen as taboo?
There's a number of elements around it. Like I think there's social and cultural norms that means that sexual health is a taboo. And then there's potentially some things around I'll say biological reasons for the lack of a better word, and I'll talk a little bit about them. But I think generally when we talk about social and cultural norms, there's things around cultural appreciations around sex and religious views around sex and then things around gender norms and who is sort of more entitled to sex, etc., depending on the gender that they belong to or the gender that they are. things around like not having the right information or having a lack of awareness around like sex and sexual practices, etc. That means that people then don't feel comfortable talking about sex. And then there's of course like things like social biases and stigma, where that is because of your gender identity, because of your HIV status, because of the type of sex that you have, because of the way you look. So there's all those sort of biases that society puts on people who have sex. So the idea that if you navigate certain sort of identities that sex shouldn't be happening, or the assumption that it's not happening. Yeah, if you're a sex worker, or if you're homeless, or if you're a migrant, all these different identities that like people might negative perceptions around, and then there's this assumption that their sex is not sort of okay, I guess. And the other thing is like inadequate education. Like people don't have like the tools and the skills to understand sex and to talk about sex, or both things, to know like the information and the facts, but also to talk about them. And then of course like we all fear judgment and discrimination, so to an extent we just worry that the type of sex that we like is something that might get us labeled as sort of a freak, or yeah, a pervert, or whatever it is. So I think that's usually what makes it so hidden at times, I guess. And lastly, that relates to like who we talk about sex with. Like we have to talk about sex, or we have to at times talk about sex with healthcare professionals. And then there's that concern that like, are they gonna understand me? Is the system prepared to hear me and acknowledge what I'm saying, and like look after my needs in a sexual health perspective? So I think like there's those concerns about like the barriers that the healthcare system might pose to someone who is actually openly talking about their sexual health. So again, that's a number of different sort of things that are socially and culturally built, and the experience of those things might be different for everyone. Like we might experience one or the other, or all of those things. But I guess the other element is what I was saying about like this idea of like the biological sort of elements of it. Like, and I'm thinking particularly more around like, I guess, disgust and repulse. There's this idea of like some sex being disgusting or some sex being like repulsive. And I don't know, the clearest example is like none of us like to think of our parents having sex, because that's disgusting, and like or that's the idea in our minds that that's disgusting, when like our parents are human as well, they have sex as well, etc. So I think like if you're thinking of like handsome Hollywood stars, then sex is okay. But if you're thinking of someone else who you don't see in that light or in that view, then there might be an element of like, I don't know, I don't want to know. So yeah, I think there's that element as well that it's helpful to consider as well, which might be related to some of the social and cultural elements, like particularly like politics around like beauty and beauty standards and things like that, but also like, yeah, filial bonds and like all these other layers of like what we find too close, and then we want to like not think about it, I guess. If we don't talk about sex, what happens is like our mental health becomes like affected, because then we're holding all these things around, like where they're like positive things or negative things. Like they might be like concerns, or they might be things that you really enjoy and want to share, and if we don't do, then you're holding a lot of that back. So I think, yeah, it's just really important to open up and have those conversations. Otherwise, yeah, we just grow this taboo, and then the generations to come like are less likely to talk about it, and then we end up like finding information where the information shouldn't be available. So I think it's important to like have these conversations, partly because like it builds that trust with the people around us that we engage with and that we care and love, etc. So yeah, it's important not to like hold those back. It just creates like a bigger sort of element of, yeah, like a bigger taboo, I guess.
Who should be concerned about sexual health?
This idea that sexual health is only a concern for some. So like general health is something that we all have, that we're all familiar with. When it comes to sexual health, there's this amount of people that think like, oh, that's for them, like they need to sort it out, they need to look after it, they need to think about it. I don't, because that's not a concern for me. When the reality is that we all have a sexual health, like whether that's good or bad or poor or rich or whatever it is, but we all have a sexual health to look after. And I think it's very much like the same thing that happened with mental health. Like mental health used to be this thing that like it was like, oh no, it's not for us, it's for them. And I think like with things like the sort of COVID-19 pandemic, like a lot more people became aware of like mental health challenges and mental health difficulties, and the conversation has become more nuanced around like we all have a mental health and we all need to look after it. Yes, of course, there's people with more severe sort of scenarios and situations that need to do different things or look after their mental health in a different way, but generally we all do, and we all need to care about it. And I think that's what hasn't happened yet with sexual health. Or if it does happen, it happens very like hush hush, like no one needs to know, I'll deal with it on my own, because it's just easier, and I don't want to be again like stigmatized or rejected or whatever it is that's worrying us. We tend to see general health more of as a human right, of course, with like politics around it and like political discourses around who is entitled to what elements of health. But generally we tend to think like everyone deserves that health. On sexual health, there's this idea of like or this sort of tier thinking in which like some are approved sexual beings and some aren't, like some are approved forms of sex and some others aren't, and like some are approved spaces to have sex and some others aren't, and some are like approved reasons to have sex and some others shouldn't be a reason to have sex. So again, that creates this idea of like them and us, like if I'm part of this, then they're the ones that need to get concerned. So yeah, I think that's one of the reasons why it's slightly seen different than general health, I guess.
Why is sexual health treated differently from other health issues?
It's interesting because there's also something around like we don't know what we don't know, you know what I mean? So with general health, it's like we know a lot of stuff. So we know if my tummy hurts, I know who I know what that feels like, and I also know like where to go to seek for that help that I need. Like for a lot of people with sexual health is like the two unknowns. Like one, I don't know what is it, like I don't know what I'm looking up, like you know what I mean? It's like I don't know what the issue is unless it becomes like very very visible, let's say, and there's things like discharges or things like that. But generally like a lot of the time it's like a lot of people don't know what an STI feels like or look like, because a lot of times it doesn't feel like or look like anything, so it's very hard to know. But also a lot of people don't know if that's the case, and if I have those concerns, like where do I go, you know what I mean? And the same with like routine checks. Like we as we age, like the healthcare system tends to be very clear on in terms of general health, tends to be very clear on like this is the things you need to do at these different periods in time, like at different ages. Some communities are very familiar with in terms of sexual health, like what are regular checkups, and it's slightly different because it's not age related all the time. Like there's elements of it, but it's also like sex dependent. So depending on the sex that you have, then you might need to define what your regular checkups are, etc. And a lot of the time it's tied, like particularly for women with pregnancy and giving birth, rather than like with sex. A lot of women start looking after the sexual health when they have to look after a pregnancy, rather than, or when they're thinking of a pregnancy, rather than before then. So yeah, it's different for everyone, but I think there's elements of like us being less used to like knowing what we're looking for and what we're trying to look after.
Should routine testing be the norm?
I think that like routine testing, it's always a good thing, I guess. It's very hard because it's this sort of double-edged sword. It's like we're trying to get everyone to test, but we also know that not everyone needs regular testing, and this is because of what I was saying about like the type of sex that people are having. But again, it's very hard to know the type of sex that people are having if there's all these taboos about talking about sex. If we're not what happens if we're not talking about sex? Like this is one of them that like people who really need like support won't know if that they do, and that like healthcare professionals might think that like this person in front of me, because of the way they look or because of the way they behave, they're probably not having sex whatsoever, and make those assumptions, and then don't offer what potentially can be sort of a life-saving, a sort of diagnostic tool for someone to improve their sexual health. So I think there's that element of, yes, it needs to be routine, but I think what needs to be routine before the testing is like the talking about sexual health and the having conversations about sexual health, you know, because that will lead us to sort of a more accurate testing. Of course, if we do it in the scenario in which we are now, people won't feel comfortable. People will say have the information or have truths about the sex that they're having, etc., because they're not completely, because there's all these taboos around it. But if we build that trust and that space for people to openly talk about sex without guilt and shame and all of that, then it's much more likely that the routine testing will follow, and the routine testing will not only follow but will be more accurate in terms of like who is benefiting from that routine testing.
How does society talk about sex?
We tend to remove pleasure from sex, like, you know what I mean? Not always and not everyone. Like, a lot of people are very good with, like, yeah, just enjoying sex and talking openly about sex as a form of pleasure. But I think generally when we think of like family and reproduction and stuff, like particularly things around sex education, we think a lot about safety, like how do I stay safe during sex? And by safety I not only mean safe of like sexually transmitted infections, but also safe with the people that we're having sex with, in terms of like our own personal safety. So there's a lot of focus on these things, which I think are great, but there needs to be a lot of focus around like pleasure as well, and like being able to say this is what I find pleasurable and this is what I enjoy. How do I do this in a safely manner, I guess. So that's one. I think there's something around like education for people who need services, but also for people managing and running services. Like, I think at the minute we have specialized sexual health services. If we were to like try to integrate this more and make it more routine within like general health stuff, then we need a workforce that is upskilled in sexual health elements, because it's a way more nuanced conversation because of all those taboos. Like, it's a way more nuanced conversation than just talking about general health. How do we ensure that workforce is prepared so that you're not just like reproducing like stigma and discrimination, and even like when the conversation is more generally outside of the healthcare system with your friends, like how do we just create spaces in which we're not, you know, we've all been either being judged for an element of our sexual life, or on the other hand like judging someone for an element of their sexual life. So it's like, how do we sort of move away from that judgment and start having more conversations around like the reasons why, the benefits, the challenges, and like generally just more open conversations about like the sex that different people have. This is all of our responsibility. It's not just we leave it to someone else and we leave it to, or we leave it to the individual to figure it out on their own, because we've all figured it out on our own. Like, not all of us, but some of us have. Like, you know, for those of us who like sex ed wasn't a thing in school and it wasn't a thing at home and like it wasn't a thing important, then we have to figure it out with like bits and pieces from everywhere. And so again, I think just making sure that we are all assuming part of that responsibility, because it is a public health sort of element, and we all have a role to play in public health, I guess. It is a really rich and nuanced conversations. It is a really amazing space for you to learn, and I think we all could do with a little bit more of that. And like the fact that other people like other things and that you're willing to listen and talk to them about it doesn't mean that you have to like those things and that you have to go out and do those things, but it's just like opening up like your minds and your heart and your life and your space to like these different ways of being sexual that a lot of people have and a lot of people bring. And I mean, I can only talk from my experience, but it's like that nothing's been more exciting and interesting than getting to learn from other people's sexual life, whether that's through practicing or just through talking, you know what I mean? So it's like there's this, yeah, I just find it like very exciting. Like I find not only having sex very exciting, but having conversations around sex like very exciting, because it's a space for like, yeah, just learning and growth and yeah.
Thank you for listening to this month's podcast. Let's keep the conversation going. By talking openly about sexual health, we can help to normalise it and break down stigma that still surrounds it.